Okay, so tell me if you've ever been in this situation. There's something that you wanted to keep doing or that you enjoyed doing, but you wanted some kind of confirmation or support of what you were already doing or believing. For example, I love to eat chocolate, but even better than eating chocolate is eating chocolate and believing that I'm doing something good for my body. Regardless of whether or not it really is true, having that belief makes it even more enjoyable to eat chocolate. So I might do something like this. I might Google health benefits of chocolate, and I pull up results. Dark chocolate is very nutritious, powerful source of antioxidants, improved blood flow, raises HDL and protects LDL. It might even look like this lady here who's clearly happy, which is another research result I've heard about chocolate. And if I scrolled down, I could investigate these. I'm sure I would find studies to back up many of these views. However, notice the way that I phrased the question was health benefits of chocolate. So I didn't look at studies on chocolate, which would have been a more objective way to approach this little search of mine. And this tends to happen a lot in our everyday lives. We have these biases, and we like it when our biases are right. This is a form of confirmation bias, which is something that we'll look at specifically this week. But even much wider than confirmation bias, there's all these different types of bias that can enter research. The way that we take the sample, the way that we analyze the data, the way that we ask the questions, the way that we present the results. And it turns out being this big blob that's sometimes hard to distinguish into neat types of bias. So as you're reading, there are labels for types of bias, and you'll have a description of that concept. But keep in mind also that many times these concepts overlap. It was very hard for me to create the quiz this week because I wanted as much as possible to give you questions that had a clear answer and that weren't kind of ambiguous, overlapping types of bias. At the same time, I don't see a lot of value in memorizing all the different labels for bias because different sites will call them different things. So I tried to do that in a way that had clear answers. Now there are some very clear types of bias, specifically statistical or mathematical bias, which deals with whether or not things in the long run will equal out. A good example of that is the standard deviation. You'll remember the population and sample standard deviation had just a slight difference in the formula, 1 divided by n, 1 divided by n minus 1. And that was all dealing with statistical bias. So by dividing by n minus 1, when we're looking at a sample, we can get an unbiased estimate of the population standard deviation. So that's something that mathematically we can correct for even after we've collected the data. Unfortunately, a lot of bias cannot be corrected once the data is in, and we'll look at some of those that occur during the actual sampling process or when the research design is made. One of my doctoral research classes that I took, the professor was very fond of saying, what is bungled by research design, he was a man who used words like that, can often not be fixed by good research methods. In other words, no matter how good your statistical methods are, if you mess up in your research design and introduce bias, you can't necessarily fix that bias in your analysis. So bias is this huge thing that's kind of working against the credibility of research and how we interpret the research. But at the same time, we have to be somewhat comfortable with its existence. So if you picture a garden, a large garden with many vegetables growing, you're almost always going to have a few weeds here and there, and that's just accepted. Of course, if you see them, if possible, you try to pull them out, but a few weeds aren't really going to affect the garden overall. If there's a lot of weeds, or if there's particularly big or harmful weeds, or the placement of the weeds is right next to the vegetables right as they're getting started, all of these are situations that can endanger the crop, the vegetable crop. In the same way, bias in small doses, especially if it's understood and handled or interpreted accordingly, usually doesn't do too much damage to the research validity. However, lots of bias or big bias, or bias that could be corrected fairly simply, like just an input or an error in inputting the data that we didn't do some kind of check to catch for those outliers. All of these types of bias can add up and can really sway the results of the study to the point where they're not really even meaningful, and that is a problem. So how do we handle this? Most of the time, you're going to be consumers of research instead of producers, but in either case, it's important to know about bias and how to handle it. So if you're producing research, of course you want to create a design that minimizes the bias, and then the way that you handle the data, you want to minimize the bias. When you're reading research, it's a bit harder because you don't really have any control over how the research is conducted, or often how it's presented. What you can do is be aware of different sources of bias, especially powerful ones, and how much they could affect the results of the study. Be aware of biases that may not even be as evident when reading the study, but maybe you can see that a certain corporation funded the study, and you know what that corporation believes, how it gets money, how it sustains its shareholders, and you see that the results of the study are strongly supporting the beliefs of that corporation or company. This is reason to be pretty suspicious and to go searching for other studies. In general, you should always look at the body of research instead of just focusing on single studies, but especially when there's reasonable question that there could be a lot of bias in the study itself, you should be suspicious. So we'll get into a lot of those methods. This should be a fun week, a lighter week. We'll end with another Hans Rosling talk. We haven't heard from him in a while.